All right, so here we go. Thank you, Paige. Appreciate that. All right, here it is. All right, everyone. So again, welcome to our workshop this morning on healthy soil. I'm really looking forward to this workshop. This is actually my first Zoom workshop that I've given, so I appreciate your patience. And if there's any questions that you have, please again go ahead and pop those into the chat as we're going along. I might kind of stop and go as we're moving through the presentation to answer questions, if it seems like that's the best way to do it. But if we get a lot of questions, I might just wait till the very end to try to go back and answer those as best as possible. So, but feel free, please, if you have a question, just to type that into the chat. So before we get started, real quick, my name is Brandon Merchant. I'm the Health and Garden Education Coordinator here at the Community Food Bank. I mostly work downstairs at the New Western Tierra Garden here at the Community Food Bank campus, but I also work extensively with some of the local schools here in the Sunnyside School District. So that's most of my work is with school gardens and with teachers and in those types of programs, as well as community garden spaces here in town. I'm a Arizona native. I was born in Yuma, Arizona, and I've lived in Tucson since, oops, sorry about that. I've lived in Tucson since 2009. I was became a certified master gardener in 2015. And, as in 2013, I started a business called Southwest Victory Gardens, where we basically did garden installations and consultation and workshops all over Southern Arizona. So I've given many workshops over the years, but this is definitely my first one on Zoom. So, all right. So there are some resources that are available to the folks here for this presentation. The whole presentation you can actually find at the second link, southwestvictorygardens.com/documents. On that page, you can find a variety of resources that relate not just to this presentation on soil health, but on a whole wide variety of desert gardening topics. So, if you're interested in growing citrus or, having backyard chickens or really anything that relates to desert gardening, there's a lot of resources there on that website. The Community Food Bank Garden Program website is also an excellent resource. You can find out when we are giving workshops, as well as some of our program information and some of the resources that are available on our website. You can find through that link on the top. So those are both there for you. And I will again share these at the very end, just in case you missed them. But, if you wanted to write those down, then you got it for you right there. So. All right, so, one of the questions we often ask folks when they come to a gardening workshop at the Community Food Bank, we often ask, why do you think it's important to have a garden program as part of the Community Food Bank? A lot of folks think of the food bank as a place that distributes emergency food boxes throughout the community. And that is definitely a big part of what the food bank does and continues to do. Especially over the last year since COVID started, those programs that the food bank offers have been, needed, more than ever. But the food bank also realizes that there are, several, there are several issues that are related to hunger that aren't just about, giving folks an emergency food box. So the garden program really addresses some of the fundamental root causes of hunger that are existing in our communities, and the garden program seeks to sort of address many of those issues. So, it's through the garden program that we can sort of begin to address some of the causes of hunger, so that in the future, hopefully fewer people will need to come and request those other services such as emergency food boxes. So those are just a very basic introduction into the garden program and why it's part of the food bank. So the garden program here, we really are all about sharing skills. We offer these workshops and trainings, and we offer a lot of leadership development through our various gardening programs. And through these trainings and leadership development programs, we're hoping to create a much more self-reliant and resilient community that basically has a long-term and sustainable food system. So we do that through partnering with local groups, local organizations, school gardens in my case. But that's really our focus, is working with folks in the community and helping to share those skills of gardening. So that's what this workshop really is all about, is about sharing our knowledge, not just from the food bank, but from all the folks in the community who have knowledge to share with us. And much of the skills and knowledge that we share along is things that we've learned from other folks in the community. So we just like to continue that tradition. All right. So as gardeners, in a desert climate, we often are faced with many challenges that a lot of other gardeners around the country may not have to face. So but with that, we really still have to be mindful of what type of gardeners that we want to be, right? And so here at the food bank, we really try and garden with a certain type of philosophy that it basically entails trying to use fewer resources, trying to garden with our climate, and be very mindful that we are in a desert ecosystem, and we want to, as much as possible, try to garden alongside that ecosystem and not try to change it too much. And so some of the things that you're going to hear repeatedly, and not just this workshop, but in all of our workshops, is some of these same ideas repeated over and over. So chief among those is the idea that healthy soil encourages healthy plants. So we talk a lot about growing roots. We don't grow plants, we grow roots, right? Or we feed the soil, we don't feed the plants. These are sort of like things that that we teach others, so that they understand that when we're caring for the soil, the plants basically can take care of themselves, and it really makes gardening just a lot easier. So we really start there at the very foundation of organic gardening, which is soil health. And then we tie in a lot of these other ideas of sustainability and limiting water use and things like that. But of course, the whole idea is that through gardening we could build community here with each other. And so that's really ultimately like what this program is all about, is just getting together and just getting our hands dirty and doing some planting some stuff. So all right. Okay, so why, you might be asking the question, like, why healthy soil? Like, why is that so important? Like, why is that the ultimate, the top of everything and the most important? And so that's sort of the discussion that I want to sort of start with, and why soil is such an important thing. So here's just a few statistics, and there are some newspaper articles on the resources page that you can access that many of these statistics were pulled from. And so if you're interested in where these numbers come from, you could find all of those on the resource pages. But just to give you a couple, really interesting facts, soil is a carbon storage, reservoir, right? When we think of, carbon storage, oftentimes we think of, forests and places like, rainforests that do, store a lot of carbon, but soil in fact stores 4 times more carbon than all of the trees and plants around the world. So it's actually the second largest carbon reservoir on the planet, second only to the ocean. And so why that's important is because over, the last 40 or 50 years, much of the best soils around the world, the world's most farmable soils, have been destroyed. Much of that destruction has come as a result of modern agriculture practices, but a lot of soil has been, turned into, farmland has been, taken and turned into, places where they're building houses, or where they're, putting up new construction for businesses. And so some of the best, farmland is actually just getting built over. So it's not just farming practices, but farming practices, modern agricultural practices are one of the leading causes of soil degradation. So as it stands now, about 40% of what's left of the world's soils are classified as either degraded or seriously degraded. So that's, really important to know, because that you can't, get that soil back, once it's destroyed, or once it's, flattened, and a subdivision is built on top of it, it's very difficult to try and restore that soil. So, what's more is that, at the same time we are destroying, much of the world's best farmable soils, we're really not getting much return, on our investment there, because nearly half of all the food in the United States is wasted. And the system that sort of has been built up around agriculture to distribute the food, and to package and harvest the food that is grown here, there are basically several inefficiencies in the system that make it so much of the food that we grow is not even able to make it to people's tables, right? So every day about 365 million pounds of food is just wasted. And that's not food that that at the end of when you're finishing dinner, and you have a little bit of leftover food on your plate, this is food that never even makes it to market, right? Through because of inefficiencies in the system. And many of us experienced these inefficiencies last year, when we went to the grocery store and were unable to find fresh produce or canned beans, or some things are still difficult to find, like canned corn and things like that. So even though we're rapidly destroying our soils, it's not really doing much for us. So it's definitely something that we want to be conscious of and mindful of, and I think that's why all of us are here in this workshop today. So all right, so I kind of just want to stop there real quick, just to kind of back up just a little bit. I do like to always, when I start a workshop, I like to sort of step back a little bit and show the big picture of what's going on, right? And to give everyone an idea of sort of like why healthy soil is so important, and some of the issues that we are facing as a society, as it relates to soil degradation. But I recognize also that many of you are here as gardeners, right? We're here to learn about gardening, and hopefully how to become better gardeners, and grow vegetables and fruits in our backyards better, and have less issues with the things that we face as desert gardeners, whether that's aridity and heat, or lack of rainfall. But I like to bring all that up, because as we move forward and start learning about soil health, what I just want to point out to you all is that one of the best things that we can do as individuals, right? If we are concerned about climate change, or global warming, or the loss of farmable soils, or inaccessibility to food, if those issues are of a concern to you, one of the best things that we can do is work to improve our soils, right? If we start incorporating the techniques that we're going to talk about today, you will be actively working to, counter all of those things that are happening in modern agriculture as it relates to, soil degradation or climate change, which modern agriculture is a major contributor of. So if you ever feel like, as an individual, you don't have much of an impact, you recycle and you try to save water and all these things, and you just feel like you're not making a huge difference, working to improve the soil around your property and your garden or wherever does a tremendous amount of good, to reverse many of these changes that are happening. So even though we're all actually here to learn to become better gardeners, it's good to realize that these techniques also have a much bigger positive impact. So you're getting like not just improved plant growing and becoming gardening becoming easier for you. You're actually making a really, really big difference in the way things are. So I just like to point that out, and so there's a lot of overlap there. So all right, so let's get into this. This is all of us together in this picture marching, to healthy soil. This is all right. So many of the things that I'm going to talk about today are based off of a book called Teaming with Microbes. Here's my well-worn copy right here. I take it out into the garden often. And this book is a very easy to understand book about the soil food web. It takes really complex topics like soil chemistry and soil biology and soil physics, and it really makes it easy to understand. So if you're interested in getting a very detailed explanation of the things that I'm going to be discussing today, just very briefly, then I would really encourage you to take a look at this book. You can get it at the public library, and the community food bank also has copies that we loan out to folks. So if you're interested and you'd like a copy, just let one of us know. You could send me an email or whatever, or you could just go ahead and reserve it at your library if you don't want to buy it. So, but everything that I'm going to be talking about as it relates to the quote unquote soil food web gardening rules, which we'll talk about later, come from this book. So, all right. So what is a soil food web? Well, the best way to think of a food web is to think of a food chain. A lot of us know what a food chain is. If you ever saw The Lion King, like I did when I was a kid, there's the scene where we learn that the antelope feed the lions, and the antelope eat grass, and when the lions die, the lions feed the grass that then feed the antelope, and we have the circle of life, as the song so eloquently put, right? So that's a very simple way to describe a food chain, right? But there are lots of interconnections often within a food chain, and when you start drawing arrows from one part of the chain to the next, you start to see this a web basically begin to develop here. So the soil food web is basically consists of organisms that live the majority of their life or all of their life in the soil, along with plants and roots, and of course any of the larger animals that may interact with those microorganisms or arthropods in the soil, right? So all of these parts of the food web are interconnected. But what's very important is that the very, very base of the food web, which is plants and roots, essentially controls this entire food web. The plants and roots determine the bacteria and the fungi and the types of nematodes that exist within the soil. And through this manipulation of all of these microorganisms, these plants can pick and choose what types of nutrients that they get out of the soil, right? So different plants need different types of nutrients, and they get them from different places. So some plants really like to get all of their nutrients from from fungi in the soil. Some plants really like to get all of their nutrients from bacteria in the soil. It's like, some people like pizza and some people like tacos, and plants are the same. So, what we want to try to do, though, is basically encourage as much variety in this food web as possible so that plants are free to pick and choose what they want and basically take care of themselves, as we like to say. So this entire interconnected food web is really the basis of soil health and how we can really start to improve our soil health. All right, so I was hoping that maybe in the chat that we could start to just do a little brainstorm, and I want to start by I want y'all to maybe type into the chat a few words that describe your soil that you're dealing with in your garden. Desert soil, that you might be working with right now or that you might have experienced. And, these could be, descriptive words. It can be, how does it feel? How does it smell? How does it look? But I just want to see, like, just to get an idea of, what your experience has been with desert soil. So if anyone wants to go ahead and start typing in the chat what they think. All right, so I see sandy, full of caliche. Okay, there's a word we'll talk about. It's dusty. That's a good word. I can agree with that. It's very dusty. Thank you, Carol. So Glenda said it's full of caliche. Does anyone know what caliche is? Does anyone know what that is? You could type it in the chat. I see clay with lots of rocks. There we go. That's very true. And it's interesting that folks, one person said their soil is sandy and one person said their soil is very clay. And if what soil is made of is either sand, silt, or clay, clay is very dense and sandy soils are very loose, and they're basically the opposite types of soil, right? But they both exist here in desert soils, right? So you have both sandy and clay soils here, so that can cause different issues. Caliche is basically a compacted layer of concrete like soil. It's caused by salt deposits accumulating over many hundreds of years of shallow rain, and creates an almost impenetrable like soil surface. All right, so someone says they have some good soil where they are, and that can also happen. I've had experiences in different parts of town, if especially near places where there used to be water or rivers, where the soil can actually be pretty good. So that's the interesting thing about desert soils, is that they vary so much. And in fact, Arizona, which is not, of course, not just all desert, but every type of soil that is classified as soil texture in the soil texture triangle exists somewhere in Arizona. So that's pretty cool to think about. But so desert soils are basically here's the characteristics that often folks think about are, there's low populations of microorganisms in the soil. So you don't often see earthworms and things like that when you're digging in desert soils. They don't actually exist in desert soil, so that's probably why you don't see them. The desert soils often lack organic matter, right? So that can be what makes them maybe seem dusty, and also adds to the compaction problem. Desert soils can sometimes lack nutrient availability. So it's not to say that the nutrients aren't in the soil, but it is to say that they aren't often available to the plants that we are growing. And we'll talk about why that is in a little bit later. Compacted, so it's very hard. Oftentimes, you sometimes need special tools like a jackhammer or caliche bar, which is a special digging tool, just to break up the soil. And another characteristic of desert soil is that it has a very high pH. All right, so now I'll have another brainstorm where, again, in the chat, I want you to think about some descriptive words that describe healthy soil. Okay, so I want you to think about, maybe if you're from, like, say, back east somewhere like Minnesota or Iowa, maybe some soil you've experienced, somewhere else other than, desert soils, or maybe when you were a kid and you remember digging in, in dirt somewhere else other than Arizona. What are some words that describe healthy soil? Again, it could be, how does it look? How does it smell? What do you see when you dig in it? Those sorts of things. Let's see. Certain- All right. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so one is that it's black and it holds moisture. So that a dark color is definitely a characteristic of what one might consider to be a healthy soil. That's one of the first things that people mention. It holds moisture. That's another great characteristic. When we dig in desert soils, oftentimes we don't really feel moisture in the soil. So yes, very much. Earthy smell. That's another one. It smells like dirt. That's and oftentimes that's one of the most common descriptive words of healthy soil, is that it smells like earth, and that's actually a very interesting characteristic. Um, let's see, it's crumbly and dark. That's right, it has a really good texture, or it feels really good, and one word for that is we call that soil tilth, tilth, tilth. All right, so here's some characteristics of a healthy soil. Now, these characteristics were all adapted from the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education.
Hey Brandon, your sound just went out.
Can you hear me now? Is that better?
Yes, I can hear you. Can other
Okay.
people say in the chat? Cool.
Yeah, sorry, I must have hit the mute button. I apologize for that. Let's see. Okay, I apologize. Again, so these characteristics of healthy soil that I have here are basically pulled from the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Division of the USDA. And there's actually 7 characteristics that they have, but I've sort of condensed them here into these 6. All right. So what we're going to basically be talking about in this workshop is how to go from desert soils over to healthy soils, right? So how do we go from bad to good, right? How do we start the process of changing our soils over to healthy soils? So okay, let's move forward, and I'm gonna come back to the slides as we move through these individual. I'm gonna go through each one of these bullet points one by one, and discuss them in just a little bit of detail, and then we'll talk about some methods for how to actually start to change our soils over. Okay, so appreciate everyone's patience. All right, so healthy soil contains high populations of microorganisms and is high in organic matter. So what does that mean, high populations of organic, of microorganisms? Well, one way to think of it is that in a teaspoon of really healthy garden soil exists, up to several billion bacteria, right? So it's the numbers are just extremely high. In fact, if you look at the period at the end of a sentence, you can probably fit about 250 to 500,000 bacteria, in that small of a space, right? And so there's just this tremendous amount of life in the soil, right? And someone mentioned in the previous when we were just describing the characteristics of healthy soil, that it has an earthy smell, right? It smells like earth, it smells like dirt. The smell of dirt is actually a result of a group of bacteria that exist within the soil, right? So all of the characteristics that we think of in soil in some way or another, um, tie back to the organisms in the soil. Now, I want to make sure that we're clear here that when I say high populations of organic matter, that the number we're talking about really is only about 5% of soil's overall content. In a healthy soil, the organic matter content should be anywhere from 3 to 5%, right? So it's a very, very, very small portion of what soil actually consists of. And the organisms, oh, pardon me, the organisms within the soil are an even smaller portion. However, it's those organisms within the soil that really make the rest of the soil, the soil possible. So what I mean by that is, for example, um, you know, without these bacteria in the soil, there would be no air exchange between the surface and the roots of plants, right? All of that air exchange of oxygen and carbon is all done through bacteria and fungi and other microorganisms. The water that exists in the soil, if it wasn't for microorganisms consistently, doing natural processes, the water in the soil would ferment and, begin to, turn into alcohol essentially, and then start to, rot. And so, and the minerals within the soil, if it wasn't for the organic matter and microorganisms within the soil consuming those minerals and breaking them down and turning them into nutrients, then none of that would occur. So even though it's just this small, tiny little slice, it really is the most important part of the whole soil composition here. Microorganisms, although make up a small portion of the soil, have an extremely important impact on the rest of the soil. So this is just an ideal um, a composition of what a healthy soil would look like. Oftentimes in desert soils, we have very high mineral content, low organic matter content, and then low pore spaces. So pore spaces include those spaces where air and water would reside. So again, high populations of microorganisms and high in organic matter doesn't necessarily mean like you want to take all of your garden soil away and replace it with compost. You really only need a small portion of that, but just for it to be considered quote unquote healthy soil. Okay, so the next bullet point: no toxins or pesticides. This is very important because synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and even organic fertilizers that have very high NPK content all can affect the soil food web negatively. They actually kill bacteria in the soil, they kill fungus in the soil. So we want to avoid the use of those products whenever possible. We also want to think about the rest of our, property. If we have a lawn in the front yard and we're spraying, Roundup on it to keep weeds away or whatever, whatever you use on lawns, 2,4-D or whatever, then, those effects can, have an entire effect on your entire ecosystem, right? So, and that can negatively affect your garden. So, but most acutely, if you just dump a bunch of, like, say, ammonium nitrate or ammonium phosphate fertilizer on your soils, that's going to have a really a bad impact on the soil food web. And any presence of those toxins or pesticides would indicate an unhealthy soil. So you want to make sure that you avoid having those. So this next bullet point is it goes into a little bit of soil chemistry, and I don't want to make it too complicated. Just the most important thing to understand with the idea of having a balanced pH or balanced nutrients in the soil, the main thing we want to understand is that desert soils tend to be very alkaline. Okay, so what does alkaline mean? Well, here I have a chart that basically is how pH of our soils influence nutrient availability in plants. Okay, so at the top, you can see a range of numbers that goes from 4 to 10. This is a representation of the pH scale. The pH scale actually goes from 1 to 14, but you probably won't find soils outside of this range of 4 to 10. So this is a great graph to use here. So now you can see there are all these different colored bands that represent nutrients that are in the soil. Okay, so at the top we have nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These are the three most important nutrients that plants need. Okay, so as you move from the center of the pH scale in either direction, you'll notice that the bands become either wider or narrower. Now, as a band becomes wider, like you can see right here at 7 pH, the nitrogen band is very wide, as is the potassium band. But as you get towards the ends of the pH scale, the bands start to narrow. That narrowing of the bands indicates that that nutrient is not available or less available at that pH level. So you can see here at phosphorus at the pH of about 8.5, that band is very narrow, which means that particular nutrient, phosphorus, is very difficult for plants to get out of the soil when it's at that pH. And so desert soils, you can see, have a pH of between 8 and 9, a very high pH. And as you go down, you can see things like phosphorus, calcium to some extent, iron, magnesium, and especially copper and zinc. These nutrients are basically very difficult for plants to get at a high pH. So it's up to us as gardeners to try to figure out, okay, how can we get our soil down to this more neutral pH in the center at about 6.5 or 7, pardon me, where these nutrients are more available. Okay, so again, you can see that at those neutral pH levels, most nutrients are available to plants. So that's why healthy soils are considered to have a balanced pH. Now, having a balanced pH or a high pH doesn't necessarily indicate the absence of nutrients in the soil. So desert soils are often very nutrient rich. There's a lot of minerals in desert soils. We have copper mines all over Arizona. We have, mineral mines all over. Our soils are full of nutrients, but what ends up happening is the nutrients get locked into the soil because of the high pH. So again, it's not necessarily that the nutrients aren't there. It's just that there aren't organisms in the soil to help unlock those nutrients. All right, so the last descriptions of healthy soil is that it is porous and it has good structure. So porous and porosity are those spaces in the soil that we think of that contain air and water. And so most of the time, it's about 25% air and 25% water in the soil. And anytime we water the garden, right, those pore spaces fill with water, and then eventually that water drains away and it opens back up again. But in a good healthy soil, there is still always just a little bit of water, always about 25%, water holding on to the soil because of, molecules and things just holding on real tight to it. So this graph sort of illustrates the different types of soil compaction you might see. So here on the left, you can see there's no pore spaces. This is a very compacted, non-porous, non-permeable soil. And this is very representative of like what a desert soil might be like, what your garden soil might be like before you add any compost or anything to it or break it up. Now, as you add compost to your soil or you start adding, mulches and organic matter into the soil, you start to develop pore spaces, but pore spaces alone don't necessarily indicate, the present a healthy soil. But over time, as you start to incorporate, less destructive soil practices, what can happen is the pore spaces begin to connect to one another. And so if you can imagine water on the surface of the soil, either from watering your garden or from rain, then you can see how, you can see how water can easily move from the surface of the soil down to the subsoil, because it can easily move through these channels, or these pores that develop in the soil over long periods of time. Okay, so this is the type of thing where it's not, it's a very difficult thing that to achieve through just, adding amendments to the soil, right? You can add compost to the soil, but it's not going to create these, it might create pore spaces within your soil, but it's not going to create these interconnected pore spaces that allow water to go deep down over, only long periods of time and patience and soil management will result in this type of porosity, right? So what I like to tell people is building healthy soil is not like baking a cake, right? You don't just, add a little bit of this, you can add compost and fertilizers and you mix it all up together and boom, you have a healthy soil, right? It doesn't work like that. It takes a lot of time, and things change, and you have to sort of make adjustments. And I often tell people it's like more like decorating a room. So for example, a few months ago, I painted my kitchen cabinets, and I had this huge plan, and I had the perfect paint picked out, and it matched the walls and the tile and everything. And then I painted the cabinets, and then all of a sudden, I don't know what it was, if it was the lighting or the what, but the all of a sudden the handles on the doors didn't match. And they just looked weird all of a sudden. And I don't know what it was about that particular paint, but it made it so that the handles didn't quite look right. And so that often happens, with soil, with soil, like, when you pull one lever, something else happens. And the only way that these things work out is, over time, incorporating healthy soil management practices, eventually will result in these characteristics that you start to see. All right, so those are basically the 6 characteristics. Of course, if there's any questions, please put those into the chat. You guys have been great so far. I don't see too many questions, but if you do have any, please put those in. So this next section of the PowerPoint, we're basically going to go into the techniques now that we can use to go from desert soils or very unhealthy soil over to a what is considered to be a healthy soil, right? So now that we have an idea of what is healthy and what that looks like, how do we get to that point? So this next part is basically going to be the techniques that you can use and incorporate into your gardening practices to try to achieve it. So, all right, let's go ahead. I'm gonna take a drink of water really quick. Okay, again, what I'm going to be going through are 19 what are called gardening rules, or the soil food web gardening rules. All of these can be found in the book Teaming with Microbes, or you can actually find them again on my website on that documents page. There's a great little half sheet that's called the soil food web half sheet, and you could print that out and cut it in half, and on one side it has the gardening rules, and on the other side it has some of the slides that we showed in this presentation already. So that's a good way to just have those handy if you just don't want to buy the book, but you just want to have those rules on hand. Okay, so we're going to walk you through these one by one, and I've sort of broken them up into the ones that are sort of related to one another. And so we'll talk about 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 at a time, and then go through that sort of in different sections. Okay, all right. So essentially all of these rules incorporate these things here. Again, we mentioned at the beginning, we grow roots, not plants. Okay, and I like to think of plants like an iceberg, right? What we see above ground exists much more underground, right? And I switched my gardening mindset to focus on that, right? So when I again, I don't feed my plants, I feed the soil. I water the soil, right? I care for the soil versus, caring for plants. If I have an insect infestation, my first assumption is what's wrong with the soil, what's wrong with, the nutrients, what's happening underground. That's always my first instinct. Okay. And so some of the ways that we're going to work to improve the soil is we're going to use compost and compost teas, and we'll talk about that in more detail. We're going to be really particular about how we use our mulch. Mulch is what, anything that we use to cover the surface of the soil is mulch. And we're going to talk about how different mulches can affect your soil in different ways. We recommend no-till or low-till gardening practices, with incorporating crop rotation and cover cropping mixed in. Again, eliminating the use of synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. And if it's necessary and you need to purchase supplements, then you often can use supplements effectively to build up the health of your soil. It's not absolutely 100% necessary, but especially those of you who are new gardeners and you're just starting out, sometimes incorporating some supplements, into the mix can get you a little bit of a head start. So these are the basics of it. And we'll cover each of these in a lot more detail, obviously. Okay, so the first 3 gardening rules of the soil food web. And again, I don't want there's a lot of big words, scientific sounding words in here that it's not super important that you understand the difference between the different types of fungi or bacteria. But just as you get a general idea of bacteria and fungi are different, I think that's the main point. So with that, number 1, some plants prefer soils dominated by fungi. Others prefer soils dominated by bacteria. So that's a very simple, thing to understand. Just like you and I probably like to eat different foods. Plants like to eat different foods. Trees like to eat different foods than vegetables, and and grasses like to eat different foods than bushes. That's basically how that works. Most vegetables. Moving on to number 2. Most vegetables, annuals, and grasses prefer their nitrogen in nitrate form and do best in bacterial dominated soils. And most trees, shrubs, and perennials prefer their nitrogen in ammonium form and do best in fungally dominated soils. All right. So this all really relates to how nitrogen, which again is the most important nutrient in the soil food web, moves through the soil, right? So as these different organisms accumulate in the soil, whether it's fungi or it's bacteria, they basically start to give off different types of nutrients. And the plant determines what nutrients those are. So if a plant says, I want phosphorus, it's going to make the soil bacteria turn, it's going to encourage more of the bacteria that produce phosphorus in the soil to grow. If a plant likes its nitrogen in a certain way, it's gonna manipulate the soil food web so that it gets what it needs and what it wants. Okay, so we can add things to the soil, but ultimately the plants decide what they want and where they get it from. So that's why I always often tell folks, don't really worry about the fertilizers that you put on your soil, because plants are going to basically get what they want and need out of the soil regardless of what the fertilizer is. So as long as it's a well-balanced organic fertilizer, it doesn't matter, if it's, made from an animal, if it's blood meal, or if it's, something like cottonseed meal or something like that. Okay. So, but just understand that different plants like to eat different things, and these different microorganisms in the soil can provide those different nutrients, right? So that's the basics of those first 3 rules. All right. So how do we get those bacteria and fungi into the soil if they don't get there? Well, that's the next 2 gardening rules. Number 4, compost can be used to inoculate beneficial microbes and life into the soils around your yard and introduce maintain, or alter the soil food web in a particular area. So compost is really one of the basically the best thing that we can do to start this process. Compost that's either purchased or made from scratch is full of microorganisms, and when we add them to the soil, they basically start to reproduce. They start to take up residence, and eventually they accumulate in large enough numbers that they're able to help our plants much more effectively. You can also add, oh, sorry about that. You can also add compost to the top of the soil. So adding compost and its soil food web to the surface of the soil will inoculate the soil with the same soil food web. So I often get the question, especially when it comes to like mulching or putting compost around trees, if it's necessary to dig the compost into the top surface of the soil, and it's not. You can actually get compost benefits by just putting it right on the surface of the soil. You don't need to dig it into the soil, and that also applies to tilling. You don't need to till compost into your garden at the end of the season. You simply can put it on the surface of the soil. All right. So what is compost? Let's talk about compost a little bit. Compost is essentially, uh, uh, what is created when we take our food waste and our yard trimmings, and sometimes we might have access to maybe livestock manures. You mix all that together and you wet it down, and it creates basically a decomposed organic material that we call compost. Compost is basically the best. If we can only do one thing to try to improve our soil health, adding compost is probably it. In fact, if you're a new gardener and you're trying to garden in soil that's never been gardened in before, you basically have to add compost to your soil in order to be able to garden effectively in it. And so for new gardens, you might end up replacing, in some cases, up to 50% of your native soil with compost. Okay. So, but what compost does is it improves the structure and tilt of the soil. It helps it hold water better. It balances the pH. It also works to eliminate food waste. But ultimately, what it's doing is we're adding high populations of microorganisms and organic matter. And so all of these things that are characteristics of healthy soil, every one of these can be addressed by adding compost. Okay, so it's really the one thing that does like everything, right? And so especially if you're there's bacteria in compost that can actually remove heavy metals and toxins and things from the soil. So if you can only do one thing to improve your soil, compost might be the best. Okay. So there's different types of composting, and we do workshops on every single one of these types of composting. Next month in May, we're actually going to be doing a whole workshop on worm composting. But in the past, we've done workshops on bin and heat composting, as well as fermentation composting. So I really would encourage you, if you want to learn more about composting, to come to one of those workshops where we go into a lot of detail and we actually build compost piles and things like that. So when we talk about different types of composting, essentially what we're thinking about is managing different types of microorganisms that are going to do our decomposing for us. So in a traditional composting method, we build these big piles, or sometimes we just add things to a bin or a tumbler type barrel or something like that as we accumulate food waste. People do it different ways, but essentially you just mix your yard waste with your food scraps, and maybe you have again a little bit of landscape manure from some chickens or something. You mix that all together and let it sit for a really long time, and basically it breaks down and becomes compost. There are folks that get really into composting and are perfectionists and do things a very certain way. But if you're like me, you just toss stuff into a big barrel at the end of the week and cover it up and do that again next week, and eventually you might take some of that out and spread it around your yard or something like that. There's also worm bin composting. Worm bin composting is where, instead of piling food scraps and landscape waste in a big pile, worm composting is usually done indoors in a very self-contained unit where we're feeding specific types of earthworms our leftover food scraps from the kitchen. So this type of composting works really well for folks who have, maybe live in apartments or who are not really interested in all the physical labor required to, turn a big compost pile. It's a really, really simple way that, you can just get started in composting at a small scale. It also just happens to be a very excellent fertilizer. So the compost that you get from worm composting, even though it's not, you don't get as much as you would from, like, say, a big bin or pile. It's a very, very nutrient dense fertilizer, so you can use it, you can use smaller amounts of it and get a lot more benefit from it. There's also other types of composting. So the first two types of composting I mentioned, bin and heat composting and worm composting, rely very heavily on bacteria that thrive in oxygen. There are also bacteria that thrive in low oxygen environments. So we know these bacteria typically as lactobacillus bacteria. So if you eat yogurt, or many fermented, products are all made using a very specific type of bacteria that thrives in a low oxygen environment. So this is a specific type of composting that uses typically buckets and or tightly closed bins that cut off the oxygen and basically create a fermentation. It's a really great method, again, for folks that are in small spaces. If you obviously the places where these types of compost originated are very densely populated areas. So this type of composting can work well in apartments and things like that. The styles also, bokashi and KNF, which is Korean natural farming, and takakura, which is a Japanese method of fermentation composting. A lot of these methods also lend themselves well to making homemade fermentation type fertilizers. So a lot of people that I know that do Korean natural farming will take different fermentations and use those as fertilizers and as pesticides and things that are all natural, right? And they're all, bacterial fermented products. So if you're really into fermenting and things like that, this might be a good option for you. So, all right. So now that we've covered the different types of composting, what I always tell folks is just find a compost method that works for you. You want it to be easy. You want it to be, you don't want to be grossed out by your compost. You don't want to upset your roommates, by having, flies and stuff all over the house. So you just want to make sure you find a method that works good for you, and just stick with that. There's no reason any one is better than the other. Just find the one that works best for you and stick with it. Okay. So this next section, since we've moved on from compost, this next section we are going to talk about mulches. Okay, so how we use our mulches actually can really change the different microorganisms that live in our soil. And if we're trying to grow different types of plants, we might consider the mulches that we're using and see how we can maybe choose mulches that are maybe more preferred by the plants that we're trying to grow. It's not 100% necessary, but it's just one thing that's going to help. So let's go through some of these more gardening rules. Number 6, aged brown organic materials support fungi. Fresh green organic materials support bacteria. Okay, so aged brown organic materials. So if you think of, if you think of cut grass, fresh cut grass is green. And if you let the grass sit there for, a few weeks in the sun, it turns brown, right? So you have brown organic materials that are usually aged and dry and very, crunchy. and then you have fresh green organic material like fresh cut grass or maybe fresh trimmings, from the garden or something like that. Each one of those is going to support a different type of microorganism. Number 7, mulch laid on the surface tends to support fungi, and mulch worked into the soil tends to support bacteria. All right, so again, you can just lay the mulch right on top of the soil and leave it, or you can work it into the top a little bit, and it's not, by doing those differently, you're going to get a different result possibly. If you wet or grind the mulch thoroughly, it's going to speed up bacterial colonization. And if you have a coarse, dry mulch, you're probably going to support fungal activity, right? So all of that together, like if you take a green material and you chop it up really fine and then you work it into the top of the soil, if you did all 3 of those things, you're probably going to get a lot of bacteria. But if you had, really big, heavy, chunky wood chips that are brown and you just leave those on the top of the soil and you don't work them in, most likely you're going to get a lot of fungal development that starts to occur, okay? All right, so let's talk a little bit more about these mulches and which ones might work better for our gardens. All right, so first of all, the mulch as much as you can. Anytime there's a bare soil can be good in some instances, especially for pollinators that live in soil. There are digging bees that prefer bare open soil, so you don't necessarily need to mulch everything, but close to it is probably pretty good. As much as possible, just leave the things that fall on the ground. If you have a leaf litter accumulation under your trees, whether that's mesquite pods or leaves of mesquite or dead weeds or whatever, just leave them. The more you do that, the more that you're going to have, fewer weeds in the future. Mulch definitely help with keeping weeds down. Mulch helps to keep moisture in the soil. Mulch helps to keep the sun from directly hitting the soil, which can bake off some of those good bacteria and stuff. So mulch is just tremendous, not just in your vegetable gardens but all over your landscape. So you can use wood chips for trees and shrubs. Long living plants like trees and shrubs do very well with the wood chips as their mulch. Anything that's heavy and brown will do well around trees and shrubs. Vegetable gardens, on the other hand, will do a little bit better with alfalfa hay as the mulch. So when you go to the feed store, you can buy bales of hay, or you can buy bales of straw. Hay is a fresh green, fresh cut alfalfa that's usually harvested before the plant goes to seed, and it's very nutrient rich, especially with nitrogen. Whereas straw is basically, it's the leftovers at the end of the season when they harvest grains. So at the end of the season, they harvest a field of wheat and they harvest all the tops off. There's all these stalks that are left over in the soil. That's all gathered up and bundled together, and that's sold as straw. So straw is brown and hay is green. And straw I tend to avoid in the vegetable garden when possible, because it usually contains a lot more weeds, and also doesn't break down as quickly, so some of the nutrients don't become as available to the plant. So I try to avoid straw in the vegetable garden when possible, but I don't mind using it around like trees and shrubs, and in areas where I don't mind there being, weeds and things like that. But, always, like I say, use whatever you have. And, if you want to use wood chips in the vegetable garden, there's nothing wrong with that. You can definitely do that. It's just that all plants have a preference is all I'm trying to get with here, but there's really no wrong way to mulch. But I will say, if you can avoid, so think biologic and not geologic. So don't rock mulch or gravel mulch is not a very good mulch. It doesn't support life in the soil. It holds heat. It reflects heat back. It contributes greatly to the urban heat island effect. Animals don't like it. Plants don't like it. So just avoid rock mulches whenever possible. All right, moving onward. Let's see. Okay. So another type of mulching that we can do is a sort of mulch in place technique that we call chop, and drop. Okay, so this is something that you can actually plan to do. Oftentimes in large garden spaces, several rows of the garden may be devoted strictly to growing crops that are going to be used to chop down and cover the soil. There are a variety of soil building seed blends that you can purchase that work very well for this process. But essentially how chop and drop works is at the end of the season, you don't want to pull your plants up by the roots, pull the roots out of the soil. That's really the worst thing that you can do is when it pertains to the soil food web, because all of the soil food web pretty much exists around the root ball of plants. The majority, 95, 98% of that soil food web exists just in that zone around the roots of plants. So when you yank those roots up at the end of the season, you're pulling all of that good bacteria and fungi and all of that stuff out of the soil. And even if you put it in the compost bin, it's still got to go through that whole composting process, and then all of those nutrients will probably be washed away by the time you put that compost back into the soil. So if you just cut that plant and leave all of those roots to decay in the soil, they will break down very quickly, and eventually, roots are organic matter, just like compost. So those roots will burn to get into decay and become available as nutrients for plants. And the spaces that those roots occupied will open up and create those pore spaces, those channels that we had talked about, so that other roots and water can move down into the deeper parts of the soil. So at the end of the season, we do what's called a chop and drop, where we chop things in place, and we allow the next season's plants to basically grow up right through them. Now you can like when I do tomatoes in the spring, and let's say I had to have broccoli in the row and I want to plant tomatoes, you can chop down the broccoli, cut up all the leaves, and cover that stump that you just cut, and you could plant a tomato plant right next to it, and that tomato will keep growing with no problem, and that broccoli will just die back. But the broccoli's not going to just keep wanting to come back and outcompete the tomato. At the end of the season, it's done. It knows that it's done, and it's going to die and let that tomato come through. And all of those broccoli leaves and all those broccoli roots are now going to feed the next season. So that's a really, really great way to mulch. Okay, excellent. All right, so we call that chop and drop. Okay, so this next section is about compost tea. So we talked earlier about the different types of composting. So there's worm composting and fermentation and bin and heat composting. But one of the things that we can actually do with the compost is we can take a small amount of compost, and we can basically brew it as a tea. And when we brew it, what ends up happening is all of the good bacteria that are in that compost can reproduce at a very, very, very fast rate. And what we do is we create a liquid that is full of all of these beneficial microorganisms. So it's a very, very, very small amount of compost tea contains a tremendous amount of microorganisms. So it only takes a few pounds of compost to make enough compost tea to treat an entire acre of crops. So, with 1 5-gallon bucket, you can brew enough compost tea to do your whole property, your whole yard, your whole vegetable garden. And you don't need very much material at all. So let's say you can't produce a lot of compost. Well, you could take that small amount of compost that you have, brew it into a compost tea, and then it'll spread around a lot more effectively. Okay, so here's some soil food web gardening rules that relate to compost tea. So number 10, sugars help bacteria multiply and grow. Kelp, humic, and fulvic acids and phosphate rock help fungi grow. Okay, so we're always talking about bacteria and fungi and what we feed them. You know, the main thing we need to understand with compost tea is if we're brewing a compost tea, whatever what we add to it will determine what grows better. Okay, and when we show the recipes a little bit later, you'll see kind of some of the things that go into it. So by choosing the compost you begin with and what nutrients you add to the compost tea, you basically can make heavy fungal teas or heavy bacterially dominated teas. So again, this can get really complicated. And if you don't know if you have a fungal compost or a bacterial compost, don't worry about it. You know, this is more for folks who are getting like really geeky and really nerdy into composting, and they want to be very specific about what's in their compost. You know, you can do that if you want, but if you're just tossing stuff into a bin and a pile, and or you're just feeding your worms at the end of the week, you know, don't worry too much about this kind of stuff. But if you really want to get into it and you want to take it up, you know, to the next level, then you can start to, you know, manipulate and change your teas up and find a compost that's made in a certain way to help along with this process. But you know, if you just take some basic compost and make a basic tea out of it, you're going to be, you know, it's going to work really, really well for you. So don't worry too much about some of this stuff. And number 12, compost teas are very sensitive to chlorine and preservatives in the brewing water and ingredients. So as again, just like I mentioned earlier about taking a class on compost tea, or excuse me, on composting, I would recommend, if you can, to do a workshop or watch some YouTube videos on how to brew a compost tea, and you'll learn about, you know, how to eliminate chlorines from the tap water, and how to find, you know, ingredients that work better, like unsulfured molasses or organic sugars and things like that. You know, you can learn a lot more, but you know, again, it's not, if you can't feed your if you can't find organic sugar, you know, the table sugar will be just fine. You know, it's not gonna be, you know, hurted or anything like that. Okay, so real quick before we get into what a compost tea is, I want you to know what a compost tea is not. That black liquid that accumulates at the bottom of your worm bin, that is not compost tea. If you have a composting tumbler and it has a little faucet at the bottom of it and you could drain liquid out of it, that is not compost tea. That is a compost leachate or a compost extract. That liquid, that dark black liquid that's accumulating at the bottom of your composter or at the bottom of your worm bin, is full of really nasty bacteria. It's full of stuff like salmonella and E. coli, things that can really, you know, do bad stuff to you if you put that on your plants or in your soil. So I tend to, you know, I don't want to say that you just need to throw that stuff away, but I would probably use it more in places like maybe around fruit trees, or on landscape plants and things like that, where you're probably not going to come in. You know, you don't want to you don't want to use a compost leachate or a compost extract as like a foliar spray, because then you're spraying a coli all over your lettuce, and then you're going to eat that, and that's not going to be very good. So that is not compost tea. What compost tea is when you take some compost, you put it in a stocking or in a you know, a bag that's porous, and you soak it in non-chlorinated water with an air pump. And when you incorporate oxygen into the mix, that allows for the bacteria to not become stagnant, and they're better able to reproduce. So what happens is when you add this compost to the water, and then you add some sugar. Well, so you can add something like molasses or table sugar. And again, on my resources page that I referred to y'all at the beginning, there's a whole bunch of recipes for compost teas. So there's compost teas that contain, you know, different ingredients for whatever you want to make. And so you can find those recipes either on my website, or if you just go to, like, say, YouTube, you can find some pretty good compost tea recipes there as well. Okay, so you take all this, you take the tea, you hook it up to a pump, and air pump, and you basically brew it for 24 or 48 hours, and all of those bacteria in the water start to consume the sugar, and they start to reproduce just like yeast would when you would add, sugar or whatever when you're making, bread, or you're making, alcohol or whatever. It's the same, basically the same process. It's just bacteria consuming sugar and reproducing. So if you're going to get really into it, and you want to make teas that are very specific to your particular garden, you can find teas that are either very bacterially dominated, like these at the top, which work really good for plants in like the cabbage family, things like kale and collards and mustard and broccoli and Brussels sprouts, those types of things. And then if you're growing, pine trees, and you want to increase, the growth of those types of plants, you can do a compost tea that's very fungally dominated. And of course, if you don't care and you're just trying to, just make some tea, then use whatever you got, and you put that on your soil, it'll work no matter what. If you put a highly fungal compost tea in your vegetable garden on cabbage, it's not going to hurt it. And if you put a highly bacterial tea on your pine trees, that's not going to hurt that either. So it's just some plants, again, have a preference, that's all. All right, so this next slide will cover really quickly, not too much here. The applications of synthetic fertilizers kill off most of the soil food web microbes. So again, avoid synthetics. You don't want to use those. Stay away from any additive that has a high NPK number. So if the front of your bag of fertilizer has numbers higher than, say, 10 or 12, I would avoid it. Avoid things like that you can't pronounce, like ammonium nitrate, ammonium phosphate, those types of things. And if you do end up having to apply, for some reason you have to, you move into a new place and you just got to get rid of all that Bermuda, there's nothing else you can do except Roundup, don't worry too much about it, just get it done. And then after that, you can drench that area with the application of Compost Tea, and it'll start to rebuild the soil in that area. And then hopefully never again will you have to apply that product. Okay, so just avoid bad stuff is the main thing. No chemicals, no synthetics. All right, so the last of the soil food web, I'm going to 16, 17, and 19. I'm going to discuss first, and then the last one I'll discuss is 18. So again, most trees, hardwood trees, conifers, they like a particular type of fungi called ectomycorrhizal. And vegetables prefer what is called endomycorrhizal. So ectomycorrhizal and endomycorrhizal. These are just different types of fungus in the soil. You don't need to remember that because, again, plants are going to determine what's in the soil, So you can actually buy mycorrhizal fungi of different kinds. On the left here, you can see this product is called Mycos. It's these are the inoculants that I was or supplements that I was mentioning earlier. You can also buy bacterial supplements. These are bacterial supplements that fix nitrogen into the soil, right? So you can buy these supplements if you're just starting a new garden and you want to, get those things into the soil. You can mix the fungi with the seeds at the planting time, or you can, if you're transplanting like transplants, you can dust the roots with the dust and then plant that. If it's in the soil, like if you buy a bag of potting soil and it says contains ectomycorrhizal fungi, it probably is not going to work. Again, you have to sort of actually touch the roots with that product. So those are just sort of like marketing things that, that say it says it contains these products, but it's not really, you're not really getting a huge benefit from it unless you're adding it directly to the seed or directly to the root ball. Okay, so number 18, this is a very important one because, rototilling for some reason has become just this very common practice in agriculture and in gardening, but there really is no basis for it. Some guy a long time ago started recommending the practice and it sort of caught on. And a lot of folks like to replicate what they see in modern agriculture, right? You see at the end of the season, you see the plow move through and break up everything, and you copy that, and without knowing any better. But But this process of excessive tillage of the soil really just completely destroys the soil food web. And it really doesn't do anything to help your soil. There records going back to the 17th and 18th century show that Native Americans, the Iroquois, who used a hoeing technique, were growing 3 times the amount of grain as Europeans who were growing using plows. So the indigenous techniques of minimal tillage and leaving plants on the surface of the soil, like those are the practices that result in a much healthier soil, right? These, like the Western farming practices that it might make your garden sort of look a certain way at the end of the season, and it looks like that you've created an area that's like easy to plant into and that you've broken up the soil. But what actually happens is that over time, that soil basically reverts to, its original texture and structure, and furthermore, you've exacerbated many of the problems that already existed. So you've killed off soil life, and you've created more compaction and all sorts of stuff. So again, the main focus is we want to get these nutrients into the soil, and we want to make sure that we're supporting them. So organic matter, bacteria, and fungi, that's the basis of the soil food web, and how to get those plants off to a really good start. So once we start incorporating these practices in, we can start to eliminate some of those long held practices that have that we've been practicing for a really long time, but maybe we don't necessarily know why. So all right, that's basically the gist of the presentation. Again, I'd like to encourage anyone that has questions to please type those into the chat. But if you don't have any questions, no problem there either. But I do want to, again, remind you that at the bottom here, the southwestvictorygardens.com/documents, that's where you can find all of the resource information for this workshop. And if again, if you're looking for the specific PowerPoint, you can look for either the Compost and Compost Teas presentation or the Soil Health presentation, which contain the majority of these slides. And also there's what is this called, the Soil Food Web half sheet. And there's also some an associated handout that goes with this presentation as well. So would really encourage you all to check out your local gardening groups. If there's someone either the Tucson Organic Gardeners or possibly Flowers and Bullets, local groups, local businesses, that's where you're going to find really products and things that are ideal for growing in a desert environment. Okay, so here we have a question from Armas. What do you suggest for starting pasture for chickens, but there is lots of sock in my clay, so rocks in my clay soil? So there's actually a good pasture blend of a seed mix that I would recommend. There's a company called Peaceful Valley Farm Supply. Their website is groworganic.com. And in fact, that website is also where you can purchase these particular inoculants, the Mycos and the garden seed inoculant. So that's Peaceful Valley Farm Supply or groworganic.com. There's a seed blend called it's called an omega-3 chicken blend that has a variety of pasture grasses, things like flax, very high in omega fatty acids. So but a lot of those crops also work as cover crops to sort of work to start breaking up the soil. Now, whether or not you should remove rocks, that's sort of up to you. It really depends on like how many rocks and how much work you want to do. I tend to, if I'm working in an area and I'm prepping a new garden bed, I will sometimes sift a lot of the bigger bulky rocks out, maybe to about a 1/2-inch sifter or 1-inch sifter. But you don't need to go as far as like sifting out to like a 1/4 inch or something like that. Get rid of some of the big rocks, some of the boulders, and some of the larger rocks, and you should be okay. Let's see. Do you recommend tilling to remove rocks? No, I mean, like if you're prepping a brand new garden bed, you are going to have to dig it or even till it, just to get that initial, because sometimes soil is so compacted you just can't even, get into it. So, once you start that first process of digging out your initial garden space, where you do have to do a lot of, soil amending and digging down deep into the soil, that's okay. But again, once you do that once, start to incorporate the other practices of soil health building so that you don't have to repeatedly rototill every year. But you can definitely, like, if you need to do it, like to start a brand new garden, like that's fine. You have to do it. So go ahead and rototill or till, dig up that initial garden bed and add compost to it, but then after that avoid tilling. Is there a benefit to building an above ground bed versus amending the soil and planting on the ground? So that there's not necessarily a quote unquote benefit. It really depends on what you want, out of your garden. If you know, and like your own, how much labor and time are you willing to put into it versus how much money are you willing to put into it? Because above ground raised beds, you typically tend to, you don't use native soil in raised beds above ground. You actually have to purchase a potting soil that's either bagged or that you make yourself from ingredients. Whereas and that can end up costing a lot of money. You have to build the bed and you have to fill it with materials. Whereas if you're going to do an in-ground bed, it's basically free. It's dirt and compost, but you have a lot of physical labor that's associated with that. So, again, if money is less of an issue, but your back is in pain, you may want to go with the raised bed. But if you're just trying to get started and you don't have a lot of resources, then starting an in-ground bed would be much preferred. Any specific tips for mending soil where cactus will be planted? So cactus are a native desert plant, especially if it's a native cactus like from the Sonoran Desert or the Sonoran region. So they typically do not require excess nutrients. And so the best thing to do is just to plant, you want to dig a hole that's big enough, for the cactus. You want to give it a nice big hole, but don't amend the soil at all. Don't add any fertilizers, but you just put a little bit of mulch on top, and that's all your cactus are going to need. Now, if you're growing something, say like a dragon fruit or something like that, and you're trying to get a lot of fruit production, you might benefit from using maybe a little a half strength, really low dose organic fertilizer or something like that. But unless you're really trying to get a lot of production out of your nopales or something, then don't worry about it. Just use ground cover and mulch and regular watering, believe it or not, because even cactus need regular watering when you first plant them. Water usage for pasture, that's another thing that's going to be unique to each person's situation. And if you have access to flood irrigation, obviously that's going to be a little bit more effective when you're doing like pasture type growing. But if you can definitely set up like sunken beds that have irrigation, and do it that way as well. It's a little more maintenance, and it's a little more infrastructure that you have to get going. But the watering, it really is just going to depend on your individual situation, and like your access to water, the size of your plots, all of that stuff you'll want to take into account. But typically you're not doing like flood irrigating and on large pastures in most places of town, because our yards just aren't set up for that anymore like they used to be. In some older parts of town, if you're still on like flood irrigation, that might be something you could think about. But again, you could grow pasture type plants, grasses, on drip irrigation just as easily. Okay, so I think that is basically, there's a question about nitricated seed. A lot of the nitricated seed is still certified organic. So if you're concerned, the coating, there are coatings of seeds that are like, synthetic fungicides or whatever. But if it's from Peaceful Valley Farm Supply, it's probably going to be an organic product. And there are organic coatings of seed coatings that aren't synthetic. So I wouldn't worry too much about that if that's an issue. Awesome. Well, thank you so much to everyone. We went just a few minutes over. I appreciate y'all sticking around for questions. And again, my email is just my name, bmerchant@communityfoodbank.org. If you want to, you can also email us at garden@communityfoodbank.org if you have any questions. So yeah, we'll go ahead and just we'll leave it there. And I appreciate let's see, yes, you can purchase products through the community food bank. We have shade cloth, we have frost cloth, and we have seedlings and seeds. We also have fertilizer, compost, worm compost, all of that stuff. So if you email garden at community food bank, just let us know what you're looking for, and we'll take care of you. So again, thank you all so much for coming. And any questions that you might think of later on, please feel free to send them my way. Really appreciate that, y'all. So everyone have a good weekend, and happy gardening to all. So good luck out there. Yes, everything's the same in the Phoenix area. The resources, you might have to find a local resource because many of the resource guides have stores that are specific to Tucson, but there are like stores like say Sprinkler World, which is located here in Tucson and in Phoenix. And if you're looking for like fertilizers and stuff like that, there are feed stores in Phoenix that do carry the same products that I recommend on my website. So you can definitely find the products in Phoenix as well. And if you check out the Southwest Victory Gardens YouTube channel, I get a lot of folks from Phoenix asking me questions, and in the chat, and I've responded to all of them with like where to go find stuff in Phoenix. So if you are in Phoenix, you can find that information on my YouTube channel in the comment section, usually of different videos. So check that out as well. Awesome, guys. Well, thank you so much, and we'll see you next month at the worm composting. So take care, everybody.